So we're on to lecture 4, the science of spirituality, because I believe that there is that spirituality is a science, needs to be a science. It's not just that we're flying by the seat of our pants and hoping that we get good results. There's actually an empiricism to science. And so that's what I want, an empiricism to a spirituality. So that's what I want to talk about in this session. And also this morning at the 9:30 lecture and the 11:30, we're strapped for time because there's a kind of the lunch was at 12:30 and we needed a break between the 2 lectures. Today, as we begin, it's kind of open-ended. We can go as long as people are comfortable with. I think dinner is at 6:30, so we can go for an hour and a half, whatever people are comfortable with. But there'll be more time for kind of the interactive portion of the session. Great. So Carl Sagan said at one stage, he said, science is not only compatible with spirituality, it is a profound source of spirituality. So he got it, that spirituality needs to employ science in the endeavor of kind of becoming more and more spiritual people. So it's not just an art form, it's also a scientific methodology. And I'll focus on that during this lecture with God's help. And so we get Jesus saying stuff like, getting really annoyed with the Pharisees at one stage, saying, you know how to read the signs of the time, the weather, you can predict the weather. Why can't you see the signs of the time when it comes to spirituality? He said, that when the wind is coming from the west, you say it's going to rain because the wind is coming from the Mediterranean. So it's going to bring rain with it. And he says, when you see the wind is coming from the south, it's going to be real hot because it's coming from the Judean desert. So you can read the signs of the weather. Why can't you read the signs of the spirit? And so again and again, the Jesus figure and the Buddha figures are talking about the fact that this is a scientific endeavor. Spirituality is a scientific endeavor. Now, the scientific method, no matter what branch of science you're involved in, and we've got a few scientists here today that I know personally of the work that they're doing. So the scientific method, I believe, goes through the following stages, whether you're a geologist, or an eye specialist, or a psychologist, or a physicist, whatever you are. When you engage with the scientific method, you're going to go through the following steps. The first one is you make a bunch of observations in your field of interest. So you're sending out your antenna into the field. The second stage, on the basis of your observations, you're going to collect data of some kind. The third part is you're going to see, is there any kind of a putative pattern, any kind of a possible pattern in your data? If you think you've identified some kind of a pattern, you're going to come up with some kind of a hypothesis to explain the possible, the possible pattern that you're seeing. So now you've got a hypothesis. Now you go and test it in your laboratory. If you get the result you expected that kind of confirms the hypothesis, you figure out this could be a statistical aberration because science operates on statistics, which means that typically at a 95% probability level, there's still a 5% chance that this could have happened by random. So you want to make sure that this was not just a statistical aberration, and so you get another scientist to replicate it in her laboratory. And if you get 3 or 4 scientists finding exactly the same result, now you've established a principle in the field. When you put together a whole bunch of principles, you've created a model of the field. I know this model should explain all further kind of observations. So once a model of the field has been created, at some stage, new anomalous data are going to present themselves. And now you're trying to tweak the existing model to cram the new anomalous data into the old model. And this has happened again and again and again in science. When we had this model, for instance, that the Earth is the center of the universe and all these planets are spinning around in these beautiful circles because the circle was the ideal form. And then we found they weren't conforming to circular motion. So then we talked about epicycles, and before Copernicus, you had all these kind of adjustments to the thinking. You're trying to squeeze the new data that won't fit into the old model of a kind of a geocentric universe. Now you're going to tweak the model, and at some stage you have to abandon the model and realize that we do not live in a geocentric universe. The Earth is not the center of the universe. And now we shift to a brand new model, which is kind of the heliocentric universe, or the heliocentric solar system at least, that the sun is at the center and we're orbiting around it parabolically, kind of elliptically, not in perfect circles anymore. So now you're massaging your kind of models to accommodate the new anomalous data. And at some stage, so many new anomalous data present themselves that no matter how much you tweak the old model, it cannot accommodate the new data. And now you've got to kind of abandon the old model and create a brand new model that must accommodate all of the old data and all of the new data. And that happened twice in the 20th century with relativity theory in 1905 and with quantum mechanics in 1920. So we had to totally revise the model. Now, that's the same model that you have to apply to the scientifically to spirituality. It is a science, and therefore we need to go through the same kind of process, in making our observations. And so, when you actually examine the literature, the spiritual literature, that is precisely what the great mystical figures were doing. The great avatar figures. That's exactly what they did. It's the very same trajectory. Observation, data, hypothesis, pattern, testing it, conducting other tests, other mystics doing the same thing, creating a principle, then a model, then new data, then tweak the model, then abandon the model, create a brand new. We've done that throughout the centuries and the millennia, at the mystical level. So that's what I mean by the science of spirituality. So what were some of the ways in which they tested their data and their observations and their patterns and their hypotheses? You had stuff like isolation, becoming a hermit, introspection, spending time in nature, meditation, fasting, chanting, dancing, creating altered states of consciousness in a whole bunch of different formats. So you're testing, your hypothesis, and you're gathering your data from many, many different states of consciousness. And that's what I meant this morning when I talked about this dream ahead of the cylindrical tower or the many floors with the 8 rooms in each. And each room affords you a partial view of kind of the mural, but until you circumambulate all of the rooms and all of the floors, you don't have an adequate model of the field. And that's precisely what the mystics have been doing for millennia. They've been visiting all of the rooms on all of the floors, and they've given you practices that allow you to do the same. So it's a radically empirical, testable model spirituality is. So it's very important to realize that, because religion is very different. Religion is operating from, faith, belief system is something that you can't prove, whereas mysticism is operating from something which is radically empirically validatable. So that's what I meant by it. Now, there's a very famous scientist called Karl Popper, who created what was called the falsifiability premise, and that the essence of the scientific method is not so much that you can prove a hypothesis, but that you can disprove the null hypothesis. So what you actually do in real science is you erect a whole bunch of hypotheses and you disprove them, leaving you only with one possible explanation of the data. And so it's like disproving the null hypothesis and backing yourself into the real explanation for your data. And that's exactly what the Zen koan is about. It's backing you into the kind of the realization of the real explanation of the data, because your intelligence can't get you there. You can't create a hypothesis that answers the question or that gives it a real answer to what did your original face look like before your grandparents were born, or what is the sound of one hand clapping. There is no rational kind of explanation for that. So you have to back yourself away from these null hypotheses into the realization this is the only explanation, that kind of explains all of the data and all of my observations. So Karl Popper called that the falsifiability premise, that to be truly scientific, every hypothesis has to be falsifiable. You have to be able to test it to find out, is it actually real? And Jesus said the very same thing 2,000 years before Karl Popper. He says, by their fruits, you shall know them. You have to test your hypothesis, again and again and again. And if your testing shows that this creates love and compassion and forgiveness in a community or in the individual heart, you're onto something. If it doesn't matter how fancy your hypothesis is or how great your explanation might be. If it's not delivering the fruit, it's not the real thing. And I think that that's what Jesus is talking about. In my Father's house, there are many mansions. There are all of these efforts to kind of explain the data of spirituality. And so that people will finally decide, what is the most parsimonious explanation of the data. And one of the things you find in science, one of the beauties of science and in mathematics and physics particularly, is that, the most parsimonious explanation of the data is typically the correct one. So in mathematics particularly, we're looking for very elegant and very parsimonious explanations for the data. So if you can come up with a very, very complex algorithm that explains your data, it probably is not the correct one. If you can come up with a very simple, elegant, parsimonious equation, it is much more likely that it is not the correct one. So you boil all of science down, for instance, to E equals mc squared. Mathematically speaking, that's an extraordinarily parsimonious and elegant explanation of the physical universe. And so by that test, it's probably the only correct explanation. So you're looking then in any scientific endeavor for parsimony and elegance of explanation. And the very same thing then would be true of the spiritual journey. Look at the most elegant explanation of the data. Is the most elegant explanation of the data that God sends lots of people to hell or creates a limbo? I don't think so. What is the more parsimonious and elegant? That God is love, and that you can be no more separated from the love of God than the sunbeams can be separated from the sun itself. It's the experience of all the great scientists, and many of these scientists were mysticists, in my opinion. People like Einstein and Tyler Descartes and Jill Bolte Taylor. These are the mysticists who can wed great science with great mystical thinking. And so again and again and again, these are the two tests that I tend to apply to any apparent solution to any human issue. And it is elegance and parsimony. You know, a river will find it the best way down a hillside. No matter where it's to twist and turn, it'll find the optimal route, and it'll create elegance in the process. If you take any of the great rivers on the planet, whether it's the Amazon River or the Nile or the Zambezi, and you measure the distance from the source to where it enters the ocean in a straight line, measure that in a straight line, and then measure the distance it actually takes as it wends and weaves its way through the terrain, and you divide that distance by the straight line distance, can you guess what you get, the answer you get? Pi. Yeah, very close. 3.141592. Yeah. All of the great rivers. And so it's like built into nature is this extraordinary parsimony and elegance. And that's what I mean when we're looking down at the scientific model for science. There has to be elegance and there has to be parsimony. So any parsimony, the simplest explanation for the data. Yeah. So you can have very complex explanations, and they're probably not correct. You get the most parsimonious one, you know, and that's the one that's most likely to be true. It's another version of Occam's razor. Yeah, right. The simplest explanation is typically the correct one. So now when you're looking at spirituality, you need to apply the same two kind of rules to it. This is a scientific endeavor. You know, if your model calls for these extraordinary acts of faith in the most ridiculous kinds of belief systems, they're probably not true. The much more simple explanations are much likely to be the obvious explanations. So that's what I mean when I talk about the science of spirituality. And I'll give you a few examples of that. In Buddhism, they speak about, or in Hinduism, they speak about the three phases: the observer, the observed, and the observing. And what they claim is that, you know, there isn't an observer and there isn't an observed, there's only observing. There's not a witness, and there's not that which is being witnessed. There's only the witnessing itself. There is pure awareness. Ultimate source is pure awareness. Now, the objects that come into awareness are not the awareness itself. They're like clouds in the sky, scudding across the sky. And so when you're looking for spiritual truth, you know, you're separating from the witness or from the observer, and you're separating from that which is witnessed and that which is observed, and you're trying to inhabit the space of pure observing and pure witnessing. So it's a participle rather than a kind of an objective or a subjective endeavor. You get the same notion in Buddhism. So that was the kind of the Hindu hit on it. In Buddhism, you have this movement, I talked about it before, the difference between Turiya and Turiyatita. Turiya is kind of the witnessing consciousness that can step outside of incarnation and observe what is happening in the world, but not get sucked into it. Turiyatita, however, is the ability to both witness and participate. And I spoke last night about, in cultural anthropology, this notion of the participant observer, that when we agree to incarnate, then we're agreeing to kind of participate in, you know, and be part of the movement, but at the same time, not identify with that, to be able to realize, yes, I volunteered for this experience on behalf of Source, but I cannot identify with this. I am, you know, allowing witnessing to happen. I'm allowing life to express itself. And so that's in that sense, the witnessing and the observing rather than the observer or the witnesser, that's the important. That's the scientific parsimonious explanation. So let me move on then to kind of transhumanism and the Siddhis. There's this great Hindu word called a sadhu. A sadhu is a kind of a holy person. And there's an attendant word that goes with it, which is the Siddhi. It's spelled S-I-D-D-H-I. So sadhu is S-A-D-H-U, and that's the person. The Siddhi are kind of the side effects of the mystical journey. That's the best way I can describe them. They're the things that tend to happen to people on the mystical journey. But the danger is that you get sucked in to these kind of side effects and begin to glorify them. And very, very typically, there are things like clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, psychokinesis, telepathy, precognition, levitation, healing powers. That many of the great mystics actually experienced these. I'm going to call them side effects. But they didn't get distracted by them. They realized that's what happens. As you elevate your body from the physical to the etheric, to the astral, to the mental, to the psychic, to the soul body, you're going to experience these kinds of gifts. But don't get distracted by it. And they give the same advice at death. You know, Buddhism is very strong in this. Do not get sidetracked by all these kind of side attractions, or take this road, you're going to have this great experience. No, take that road. You have to stay focused completely on the pure light and just move towards the light. And having had the experience of assisting many people in the dying process, you know, what I constantly tell them is, you know, focus on the light. Do not be distracted. I was near death myself on 3 occasions. The first occasion, living in Africa, I had typhoid. I thought I was dealing with malaria. I was living alone, you know, and I knew I was dying. And my body is shivering like crazy, and my mind is going crazy, and my emotions are all over the place. And all of a sudden, I hear this voice saying to me, your body is doing what bodies are built to do, but you're not your body. And your emotions are doing what emotions are built to do, but you're not your emotions. And your mind is doing what minds are built to do, but you're not your mind. And all of a sudden there was this extraordinary calm, you know, and I obviously survived it. But I keep saying that to people whom I've accompanied in their dying process. Your body is doing what bodies are built to do. Don't identify with your body anymore. Your emotions are doing what emotions are built to do. Don't identify with your emotions at this stage. Your mind is doing what minds are built to do. Do not identify with what your mind is doing right now. Focus on the light. And we have the privilege of having an extraordinary healer in our midst today, Julie, who has accompanied many, many, many people in the dying process and witnessing what happens at that stage, and the people, the kind of the angelic beings and the family members who come in to escort the person in that transitionary process. So that's what I mean here, that Siddhis will be attendant upon the spiritual journey, but don't get distracted by them. They're beautiful and they're important, but they're not the object of the exercise. The object of the exercise is the pure light of divinity itself. Now, unfortunately, we're living at a time where there's an effort to create what I'm going to call prosthetic Siddhis, an effort to artificially create these experiences through a kind of a transhumanist agenda, through turning us into kind of artificial robots, you know, where we have these extraordinary abilities to see at a distance or hear at a distance, you know, or to levitate in airplanes or whatever. So constantly seducing us into what I'm going to call synthetic Siddhis, and to kind of hope that we're going to get seduced by these and abandon our soul self and our journey back to source. And for me, it's it is the pedophile seducing the school child into the car with the offer of candy. That's the transhumanist agenda. It's trying to, you know, seduce us aboard. You have all these extraordinary gifts. You just sign up, you know, put this implant in your brain or whatever. You'll have these extraordinary abilities. You never forget anything again in the future. That's the candy. And the pedophiles are Homo sociopathicus trying to develop, you know, Homo artificialis. And it looks really, really good. And the benefits are extraordinary, but there are side effects which are separating us from source. And that was my definition in my dream of the difference between sin and evil. That whereas sin is just the kind of the transgression of a culturally created precept, that evil is kind of the cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to separate souls from source. And that's the transhumanist agenda. And that's the kind of the seduction of artificial intelligence. If it ever were to become conscious, I don't think it ever can become conscious, but it certainly can develop a level of intelligence which can mimic consciousness and seduce us in the process. So we're in danger of outsourcing the Siddhis to soulless technologies and to lose our innate abilities in the process. And the ascension process is doing this naturally, is doing this at a soul level, that we can attain these states, but not get seduced by them, and certainly not give over our power and believe that some kind of an artificial robotic existence is going to confer all of these benefits, because it robs the soul in the process. So basically, that's what I'll say just for now. Section C, I just want to talk about ritual here for a moment. I believe that vocalizations are the language of animals, and that words are the language of humans, that rituals are the languages of communities, and that silence is the language of the mystics. So there's 4 different levels of communication. Vocalizations, you hear the animals in the wild doing this. They're vocalizing, and that's the way animals communicate. Humans have developed, a language as their method of communication, so verbalization rather than pure vocalization. The rituals then are the language of the community. These are the ways in which the community addresses the members of the community. So ritual is really important. And then ultimately silence is the language of the mystics. When you finally get to the place where you don't need ritual anymore, then you're hearing God and you're speaking to God. Now, ritual then, insofar it is necessary, and it is necessary for most of us, I would describe it as a multi-sensory, multi-modality expression of a community. And we do this throughout life. You go to a ball game here in the States, an NFL game, and there's a whole ritual attendant upon it. There's a tailgate party that happens before the game begins. There's the chanting. Each group has their own chant for their own team. There's the kind of the uniforms. The teams are wearing different sets of vestments. There are different kinds of rules for different kinds of games. There are yellow flags when the referee sees a foul and he throws down the yellow flag. So there's hot dogs and there's beer. So there's really a communion service that happens before, during, and after a ball game. And that's the ritual of the community expressing itself, in the format of a ball game. It's beautiful, We get the same thing, in ordinary life. When traditionally a gentleman would meet a lady and doff his cap. The origin of that is when there were knights who wore helmets and their faces are covered, and they meet somebody and they want to say, you know who I am, I'm just covered. So he would raise kind of the facial mask and identify who he was. And that continued when we no longer wore suits of armor of just tipping the cap to a lady. You're in no danger. This is who I am. I'm your friend. The same thing had to do with the handshake. When you shake somebody's hand, typically you want to reach your right hand for their right hand, because 90% of the population is right-handed. Now, if I pretend to be your friend and I say, Robbie, I'm your friend, and I reach out, and Robbie reaches out his right hand and we shake hands, but I'm a lefty and I got a dagger behind my back and now I'm going to stick it in Robbie's chest. And so in many languages, the word for left, it's a gauche in French. In many, many different languages, it's a pejorative, because a lefty you can't trust. And so the handshake was a sign of, this is my weapon hand and it's not carrying a weapon. Therefore, I'm your friend. And you can't trust a lefty because he could be carrying a dagger in his left hand. And so in Swahili, we call it mkono wa kulia and mkono wa kushoto. And kushoto is a kind of a pejorative in a sense, the left hand. In Irish, we call an law of das, agus an law of clay. The law of das means literally the nice hand, and the law of clay is kind of one you can't trust upon. And so we differentiate. So even in a handshake, there's a ritual of friendship and kind of breaking down any kind of suspicions the other person might have. The same thing is true of a hug. A hug basically is a kind of acknowledged representation that there's only one of us. We're literally joining our bodies together in a hug, because at some deep spiritual level realize there is only one body. It is the body of God. And here's the body of God embracing itself. So the same thing is kind of when you kiss somebody, particularly kiss on the lips. My belief system is you're exchanging breath, and breath is spirit. In many, many languages, a single word means breath and life and spirit. In Hebrew, the word is ruach. Ruach means the breath of God. It means the Holy Spirit, and it means the life form. In Greek, we use the word pneuma. Pneuma can mean breath or life or spirit. In Sanskrit, the word is prana, breath or life or spirit. In Swahili, the word we use is pepo, being breath or life or spirit. It even sneaks into English as inspiration, literally means to take the spirit in, to breathe in, or to be creative, or to be alive. And expiration means to let go of spirit, to breathe out, or to die. And so the exchange of breath, the first thing God did, he breathed into this creature he had created to give it a soul. So it's almost like we're exchanging our soul stuff with each other. And that's why Judas was so devastating to Jesus that Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss. That this ultimate sign of exchanging breath and life and spirit became the symbol for the soldiers to say, this is the guy, go get him. And so again and again and again, we're using these extraordinary daily rituals to communicate with each other. You know, animals do exactly the same thing in their mating rituals. You know, there's a particular kind of dance that they ritualize. There's particular kind of feathers they're going to wear. You can distinguish the males from the female. The males very, very often are much more colorful than the females in the ornithological world, particularly. So colors, pheromones, they send out pheromones as part of the mating dance, and particular kinds of sounds. So there's an entire ritual that the animal kingdom goes through in its mating processes. So ritual is vitally important. And we try to kind of capture that in really great liturgy, as I mentioned this morning. You know, the high mass where you got the visuals, you got the vestments, the different kinds of vestments the priest is wearing for different seasons of the year. You got the stained glass, you got the architecture, you got the statues. So you've been embraced at a visual level to change your state of consciousness. Your olfactory senses are being activated by the thurible swinging and the incense. There's movement, there's mudras happening here, joining hands, bounding, genuflecting. So there's literally, you're engaging in mudras of various kinds as part of this. There's the taste of the bread and the wine. There's the touch, you know, the hugs, the sign of peace that we're exchanging. So you're trying to energize every one of the senses in order to create an altered state of consciousness, which allows you to have an individual Gnostic experience, an altered state of consciousness. Now we do the very, very same thing, you know, in our sacramental life, particularly in the Catholic dispensation. So there's a significant difference between signs, symbols, and sacraments. A sign is one physical reality standing for another physical reality. And so a road sign is a piece of metal with different kinds of paint on it that represent the fact that if you keep going for another 5 minutes, you're going to meet a piece of tarmac going off to your right or off to your left. So it's a piece of metal, a physical thing, standing for another physical thing, a roadway. So signs are one physical reality standing for another physical reality. Symbols are different. Symbols have 1 foot in physicality and 1 foot in the metaphysical. And so, for instance, you know, a hug or a kiss is a symbol. There's a physical aspect to it. You're joining bodies or lips, you know, but you're symbolizing something which is non-physical, love or friendship in various kinds. So symbols are a much higher form of, than mere signs. But then the sacrament is the ultimate kind of symbol, because the sacrament actualizes that which it symbolizes. It actually causes to be that which it symbolizes. So, but that depends on the mindset of the participants. So I use this example. In the old days, if I was dispensing communion, you know, as a priest, you know, and somebody comes out really, really devoutly, and the hands joined and put their tongue out, and I put a piece of bread on their tongue, they're having a real encounter with Jesus. This is a sacrament, because they're in an altered state of consciousness where they've transcended time and space, and they're having a real encounter with Jesus. A young kid comes up and he's got a wad of chewing gum in his mouth, and he's going like this. And then he sticks out his tongue, and I put the host in his tongue, and he goes back to his seat. What happened is basically a piece of chewing gum wrestling with a piece of bread. That's all that happens. That's it. There's no sacrament involved in it. So a sacrament is dependent on the mindsets of the participants. Now, the difficulties are these, that a sign can be made to tell a lie. I can take a road sign that's saying Healdsburg is off to the right, and I twist it around and I point it off to my left, and you think that Healdsburg is way down this way, so it can tell you a lie. And a symbol can tell you a lie, just like Judas did with the kiss. He told a lie. you're my friend, my guru, my avatar, whatever. And all he's doing is says, this is the guy, arrest him. But a sacrament cannot lie. A sacrament properly participated in with the mindset of all involved in it, it delivers the goods. It literally delivers that which it symbolizes. So then sacraments happen when the liturgical symbols lead to an altered state of consciousness. And that is the equivalent of what Sanskrit is doing in its communication, in the words, its 51 symbols, what the Aboriginals are doing, in Australia, and what Aramaic is doing, that in some senses, this is the capture of the sacrament, a kind of, in some senses, the linguistic, it's a linguistic sacrament as distinct from a liturgical sacrament. So what they allow us to do, real sacraments allow us to select out any reality from the matrix through our attention and our intention. Everything is simultaneously present everywhere. And it is the sacrament of attention and intention, an altered state of consciousness, that selects out the kind of the result that we want to experience. So that's all I'll say then about rituals. The next one I called Reinstalling God on the Human Hard Drive. Because God has been exiled from the human hard drive for a long period of time. We've created kind of algorithms in which God is not even needed anymore. So it becomes really important that the function of the Mysticists is to reinstall God on the human hard drive. And this is the antithesis of what the transhumanist movement is about. So I'm going to mention a few pieces of data points right here. So I talk about quantum spirituality. I want to see the movement from confusion to fusion, with source. And that the very, very same way in which a kind of a nuclear explosion is occasioned by fusion or fission, and it releases the extraordinary pent-up energy of the system of the nucleus, for instance. That's what's happening. The nucleus is the source. It is God, or whatever other word you want to call it by. And so there needs to be some kind of fusion, that we need to go from confusion to real fusion. And this is what I mean by quantum spirituality. And so I take this beautiful Hindu notion, the Trinitarian formula in Hinduism, which is Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And for me, Brahma represents creation in some senses. Vishnu represents homeostasis, and Shiva represents the dismantling of the current configuration so as to create more elegant and more complex versions. And so there's this great scientist in the 1970s called Ilya Prigogine. He won the Nobel Prize for Biochemistry in 1977. He was a Belgian-Russian biochemist, and he solved an ancient problem in science. Because according to science, the second law of thermodynamics is the law of entropy, that all systems left to their own devices eventually run themselves down into chaos. If you put a cup of coffee on the countertop, a steaming cup of coffee, and go away for 4 or 5 hours, you're going to come back, it's going to be tepid. It'll run itself down into chaos, a random distribution of its atomic structure. You put a bicycle out in the rain for the winter, it's going to rust away. It's going to be nothing left at the end of the winter. So entropy is the belief system that every closed system runs itself down into chaos eventually, and they call that entropy. Now, at the same time, we're watching more and more complex life forms emerge. So how can these two things be true? How can you have entropy, where systems just run themselves down into chaos, at the same time increased complexity evolving? And he solved it with what he called dissipative structures. He realized that a system can reconfigure its internal elements and create much more complex formats from the recombination. You don't have to add anything or subtract anything. You just need to reconfigure the elements to get what you need. And that was the example I used last night. If you're creating a jigsaw puzzle and you're putting the pieces in the wrong places, you're not going to get the picture on the box. To get the picture on the box, you don't have to add new pieces or throw away some existing pieces. You merely need to disassemble the wrong configuration and reassemble the existing pieces in a different configuration, and bingo, you get the picture on the cover of the box. And so that's what I mean then, that when I think about the Hindu god Shiva, Shiva is not this destructive force that just lays waste to everything. Shiva is that aspect of the divine that disassembles existing kind of configurations in order to reassemble it into more complex life forms. So we go from just kind of basic kind of fear-driven religion to mystical spirituality in the process. And then it's a staged process. So, you know, once Shiva has done his work, now he hands it back to Vishnu, and Vishnu is about homeostasis, is now holding this new configuration in place until we're ready for a new dive. And then Brahma will get involved at this stage as well. So that's my understanding of the Hindu Trinity. To use a totally different kind of a model, there's this, there's a word in psychology which is called pareidolia. And it's the belief system that it's a fallacy that claims that pareidolia is the kind of temptation to infer meaningful patterns from random data. So you're looking at totally random data and you're inferring a meaningful pattern from it, and they call that pareidolia. So pareidolia then, far from being the inferring of meaningful patterns from random data, in my opinion, it's the inferring of pre-existing potentia into actuality. So I've used this example before. If I were to take a blackboard and to put 1,000 rows of 1,000 dots on the blackboard, so now we've got 1,000 rows and 1,000 columns. So now you got 1,000 times 1,000, you've got 1,000,000 dots on the board. And I said to Roger, can you kind of show me where the elephant is in that picture? But it's just dots. And I said, no, there's an elephant in there. And I give you a piece of yellow chalk. Roger will be able to kind of bring the elephant forward just by, you know, connecting particular kinds of dots. They're all in there. So if he connects the correct dots, the elephant comes into the foreground because it existed in potentia right in there. And now I give to Andrea and I say, I give her a piece of red chalk and I say, Andrea, can you show me the Taj Mahal in that picture? And Andrea says, it's dots. And I said, yeah, but the Taj Mahal is hidden in the dots. Can you uncover it for me? And she joins a whole bunch of other dots and bingo, the Taj Mahal, it comes to the forefront. So pareidolia, far from being the inferring of meaningful patterns from random data, is the bringing into the foreground, into actuality, that which is potentially always present. And that's what this screen is doing right now. I'm looking at a bunch of people, you know, on Zoom. What I'm actually looking at, I'm looking at tens of thousands of pixels, which are either on or off. It's binary mathematics. Every pixel is either on or off, it's lit up or it's not lit. And from that extraordinary combination of possibilities, I can see, you know, I can see Viola, I can see Rusha Wallace, I can see Joe Gilroy, I can see blues and greens and reds. And when they speak, I can hear them speak. So it's only a question of which pixels do I light up and which pixels are dormant, but everything is present. So for me, pareidolia is not the illusion of inferring meaningful patterns from random data. It is the ability to bring to the forefront that which is hidden in the data. And ultimately, the kind of the ultimate screen is God herself. And the question is, you know, how many pixels can we light up in order to experience particular aspects of the divine? So life on earth, in some senses, is simply a pixelated screen, and we are the pixels. The question is, am I on or am I off? Am I lit up or am I in the dark? And what kind of a picture are we creating as a human family? In this beautiful visionary experience about 2 or 3 years ago, right before Easter, I was looking for some kind of an image that could explain Easter to me. And I found myself on this gorgeous, gorgeous beach, this sandy beach, with hundreds of thousands of people scattered all over the beach, people doing their own things. And in this vision, I'm elevated above the beach, higher and higher and higher and higher, until finally I can only see people as little pixels on the beach. And what I had noticed was that when I was on the beach level, everybody is carrying a sombrero, these huge big hats. They're carrying them by their side. When I elevated sufficiently, at some stage, there was some music, some mystical baton, some mystical conductor who started playing music, and the people on the beach started to configure themselves into particular clusters. And then they put on their sombreros. And there were 2 colored sombreros. There were green ones and blue ones. And when I elevated sufficiently, I suddenly realized they'd kind of configured themselves into 2 circles side by side. And what I was watching was this extraordinarily beautiful map of planet Earth, 2 circles. And the green represented the land and the blue represented the water. I was looking at this extraordinary vision of the planet, the two hemispheres of the planet lit up by these sombreros. And then suddenly there was a screen underneath, and I'd realized there were other people who were carrying black sombreros and white sombreros, and they stood in a line, and from where I was, I could see what they spelt out. And what it spelled out was, I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. And so basically, I'm looking at tens of thousands of people wearing sombreros, you know, picturing the planet and giving a message from source. I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. And that's what it's about. That's the pixelation of incarnation, of trying to identify those inherent patterns, because it is not an illusion. It's the identification of what really exists in the data. Now, what is the most parsimonious and elegant kind of representation of the data that you can infer in your lifetime from the experiences that you're having? That's what it's about, because it's about birthing God. Yes, I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. This is a statement that Jesus makes in John's Gospel at the Last Supper. I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. So for me then, real science and real spirituality are complementary lenses, so that we're meant to be then agnostic intermediaries. Those we can stride both real science and real spirituality and benefit both in the process. Where I lived in Kenya, we had all the big animals, hippos and rhinos and elephants and lions and zebras and all kinds of creatures, and giraffes. And the giraffes are these 18-foot tall creatures, and their favorite food was the acacia tree. And because of their long necks, they can grow up to about 18 feet high. They could kind of eat the branches of the acacia trees up to 18 feet. And the acacia trees were not happy with this process. And so the acacia trees had developed a kind of a defense mechanism where they released pheromones, which were really kind of ugly to the giraffes, but it would take them about 15 minutes to marshal enough energy to kind of expel these pheromones into the atmosphere. But what happened was that any of the kind of acacia trees which were downwind from the one which was being assaulted right now picked up the message and began marshalling its own defenses immediately. So one tree had to kind of sacrifice itself to save its brothers and sisters. So when the giraffe got to the next tree, he couldn't eat it because it was noxious to him. And so here were these plants informing each other of danger. And they did that through pheromones. And the same thing, ordinary plants do it, by communicating through their root systems underground and alerting other plants of the same family that there's some kind of an assault about to happen or happening right now, the bacterial assault or an animal or whatever. And so this information is communicated through the subterranean communication system. And also, in that sense, then, they're using this very advanced technology to do three things: to recognize the danger, to alert others to the danger, and to defend themselves against the danger. So it's a tripartite response. Recognize the danger, alert others to the danger, and then defend yourself against the danger. And that's part of the importance of the spiritual journey, and particularly the movement into transhumanism, that we have to be able to recognize the danger, we have to be able to alert each other to the danger, and we have to be able to defend ourselves against the danger. And I have a rule for myself. I've said many, many times that 80% of what I say in a homily or a lecture, I try to be a kind of esoterically mystical and kind of encourage people to reach for God. And 20% of the time, I'm going to challenge what I see around me and say, you have to be aware of the fact this is happening. You're in danger here. Wake up already. And so alerting and defending against these. So this is part of the science of spirituality, to be able to recognize the dangers. And all of the great avatars do that. Jesus will confront the Pharisees. Mahatma Gandhi will confront kind of apartheid in South Africa, where he lived for a period of time. Again and again and again, you have to call out the dangers that you see it and awaken the sleeping populace to the assault that they're experiencing right now. And so that is the kind of nature. Then plant life becomes a great teacher for us in doing these three things: recognizing, alerting, and defending. Now, the lowly caterpillar is another great teacher for us. So at some stage of its existence, this little creepy, crawly creature that's very, very, unassuming in its appearance and takes forever to go nowhere. And yeah, literally takes forever to go nowhere, which is a pun in a sense, because when you kind of break up the word nowhere into two words, N-O-W-H-E-R-E, nowhere means now, here. And so the caterpillar, because it's so slow, is now and it's here. And the part of the trick of life is to realize that you're here now because you volunteered to be here now. There is only the present moment. So nowhere, when you think you're nowhere, you're now and you're here. So pay attention to the fact of this is what you volunteered for. It's exactly when you volunteered for and how you volunteered to be. But this little creature, this caterpillar, at some stage, which is taking forever to go nowhere, builds itself a cocoon. And it begins to disintegrate into this extraordinary goo. And it's upset by this process. And so it attempts to kind of fight against this process of a radical self-disintegration. But what happens is it releases different kinds of cells, which biologically are called imaginal cells. And these imaginal cells reconfigure the existing system to create a butterfly. It's not adding anything. It's not subtracting anything. It's doing an Ilya-Prigogine on it. It's doing a Shiva number on it. It is taking the existing, matter, the existing cellular truth, and reconfiguring it into a totally different articulation, which results in a butterfly emerging, this extraordinary creature that is kind of like an angel on wings from the very same material, just by reconfiguring and reimagining the possibilities. So imagine, was it John Lennon that sang that song? Imagine. Imagination, as I pointed out to you, is not a fantasy. It is not about, making up stuff that's not real. It's about volitionally shifting your state of consciousness, entering into different dimensions, encountering different energies and different entities, exchanging information with them, learning from them, cross-fertilizing with them, and bringing that information back into this waking consciousness, and then living your waking life with this new profound redistribution and reconfiguration of the data you've gathered and the wisdom that you've acquired. And so our overarching kind of vision is that spirituality is meant to accomplish this, scientifically. This is a scientific endeavor. And the final image I'll give before I end is this, that I remember one time listening to a story about a little boy, a 9 or 10-year-old kid, who was watching a monarch butterfly trying to extricate itself from its cocoon. And it's taking a long, long time to get it, and it seems to be in real trouble. And the little kid is filled with compassion for this creature. So he decides to step in and help. And very, very delicately, he starts breaking the cocoon asunder so as to release the butterfly from inside. And indeed he does. He liberates the butterfly and he cripples it in the process, because it's the process of working its way out of the cocoon that releases the lactic acid into the wing structure of the butterfly. And so without that energy, without that struggle, the lactic acid is not secreted into the wing structure, and the butterfly will never fly, It's liberated and it's crippled. And for me, that means that when we experience hardship in life, this is not an accident. This is part of the agreement that it is working through the hardship, that is the key to going forward. In order to experience your soul self, you have to experience your space suit self with all its inherent vicissitude. And therefore, you can only be liberated and empowered, when you accept the hardships of life as an individual level and on a community level. So it is the trick of turning, instead of turning pain into suffering, we turn crucifixion into resurrection. Namaste, my brothers and sisters. So Julie's question was that, what do I mean by transhumanism? What's the difference between transhumanism and mysticism? Transhumanism, as I said, is the effort to create what I'm going to call synthetic Siddhis. They're going to seduce us with the kind of the carrot of saying, here are the abilities you'll acquire if you subscribe to this transhumanist agenda. We'll turn you into these extraordinarily intelligent beings who'll never forget anything ever again. You'll be able to rid yourself of all kinds of diseases. You'll live forever. And the problem is that you live forever as a robot, as Homo artificialis, under the dominion of Homo sociopathicus. We'll call the shots. We'll program what you will experience, and we'll hack you if you're stepping out of line. So literally everything you experience will be pre-programmed by some kind of a cabal that decides how they want you to be. You're literally going to be just these kind of robotic characters with no free will whatsoever. So there's this example that I've used previously in homilies. If you take this room right here, and I'm looking down at that corner of the room, and I'm looking at 3 axes. So there's an axis that's going along the floor to my right, and I'm going to call that the x-axis. And there's an axis that's going across to my left. I'm going to call that the y-axis. And there's an axis that's joining the floor to the ceiling. I'm going to call that the z-axis. And I'm going to ascribe characteristics to these 3 axes. I'm going to call that one, I'm going to call it compassion. And I'm going to call this one freedom. And I'm going to call this one self-awareness. And you can determine very, very precisely mathematically any point in this room by giving you a measurement along those 3 axes. I can tell you, for instance, the tip of this computer right there. You want to ask me, where is it located? I'll give you a measurement along the x-axis. I'll give you a measurement along the y-axis, and I'll give you a measurement along the z-axis, and it will exactly pinpoint where that point is right now. There's the top of this flower here, this plant here. Where is that located? I'll give you a different measurement along the x-axis, along the y-axis, and along the z-axis, and it'll pinpoint exactly where that article is. And so I use this and I say the x-axis is compassion. So we start in the corner and compassion is 0. I'm a complete narcissist. I'm totally self-engrossed. I'm a little neonate who needs to be self-concerned totally. But I need to grow along that axis until I become more and more loving and more compassionate, until finally I become a Mother Teresa. I'm extending myself for others. Now that's what it looks like when I max out on the x-axis. When I go to the y-axis is about freedom. And there's this huge difference between free will and freedom. Free will is the ability to do as pleases me. Freedom is the ability to do as pleases God. So the only truly free person is the person who's making constant choices for the good. Otherwise, I'm addicted in some fashion. To the extent that I'm making less than good choices, I'm addicted to something, my self-image, or kind of chocolate in my case, or something else. And so that represents freedom. How far along that axis am I? And then Jesus Christ obviously is all the way to that wall, totally free, because everything he does, is done freely without any sense of being, driven by kind of self-need. And the third axis is self-awareness. And in the bottom corner, self-awareness is identification with my ego. And then at some stage, I begin to identify, let's say, with my emotions. I've moved up a little bit. I've identified with maybe in my thought patterns, I've moved up a little bit. I've identified, for instance, maybe with the relationships I'm in, I've moved a little bit. I've identified with the profession I have, I've moved a little bit. But until I move all the way up to the realization that I am a bite-sized piece of God who volunteered for a human incarnation, until I reach that top piece, I'm not fully self-aware. Now, you can take these kind of the Homo sociopathicus, and who are they? Their self-awareness is totally ego-bound. They're not free. They're addicted completely to power. They have no compassion. They kind of they're stuck in that bottom corner there, and they're never going to move, because their identity is their ego. Their compassion is non-existent, and their freedom doesn't exist because they're completely addicted to power. Now, where does Homo artificialis lie? Or the transhumanist person who's signed up, for whatever form of induction is going to make them Homo artificialis. How much compassion do they have? They only have as much compassion as Homo sociopathicus dictates they need. And it'll be a kind of a synthetic compassion in order to get something from you that they want. So it's not compassion because they're concerned about you, because they're playing you. And this is kind of the typical narcissist. The narcissist knows how to play every person and every situation to get what they want. They could care less about you. So actually, what kind of compassion does the transhumanist person have? Only the compassion allowed by Homo sociopathicus in order to obtain some kind of thing that Homo sociopathicus needs. It's not going to benefit even Homo artificialis themselves. How much, freedom do they have? They have no freedom. They're being dictated to, they're being programmed, and they're being hacked. So they have zero control over their own choices. So there's zero freedom involved. And what is their self-awareness? Their self-awareness is literally that they're bathing in the amniotic fluid of the delusion that they're kind of doing great things for themselves and for the world. So they're stuck in that corner over there. Homo sociopathicus is stuck there. Homo artificialis is stuck there. Jesus Christ is up here somewhere at the very top here where the three axes max out. Maximum compassion, maximum freedom, and maximum self-awareness. And each one of us is somewhere in this room. So someplace in that room you reside because of your measure of compassion, your measure of freedom, and your measure of self-awareness. Now, your job is at some stage in some incarnation to go from where you started, which was the bottom corner on the floor, to the top corner where the walls meet the ceiling. What are some present day examples? We've been lucky enough to see some of these people, the Mother Teresas of the world. I wouldn't put her in the top corner, but certainly in compassion, she's maxed out compassion. I see no form of addiction whatsoever in her behavior, that she's only concerned with, the freedom of pleasing God. Her self-awareness, I think she lacks a little bit there because she's buying into a Catholic orthodoxy that would claim that she's just a sinner on planet Earth, and that God needs to save her. So her self-image is that of a kind of a suffering sinner who needs to be redeemed by the death of Jesus. So on the z-axis, she's not very, very highly evolved, I would think. I think maybe people like Ramakrishna, or Sai Baba, or people like that will be much further along because they're completely compassionate beings. Their self-awareness is the realization that they're God stuff, and they're addicted to nothing except for doing good. So I would say Mahatma Gandhi is very, very high up. Mother Teresa, but she lacks her theology, is crippling her in a sense in that way. Hopefully next time around she'll let go of that piece. So I would see people like that ilk are people who demonstrate a very advanced state on each one of these three axes.
I wanted to ask you, Seán, whether you'd heard of the term cishumanism. So it's kind of the opposite of transhumanism.
Okay.
And using that Latin word cis, meaning like this side of, instead of trans, which is like being across from. Okay. And cis. So have you heard of that?
No,
that term? No, okay.
Yeah.
Well, cishumanism is the opposite of transhumanism. Okay. So it's all about affirming mortality and like the finiteness of life and the natural decomposition of all things and returning to earth and returning to God. So I was having thoughts about how if we're going to have a discussion about how we face transhumanism, or how we try to bring forth like a contrary view to transhumanism, is cishumanism where we begin? So do we need to look at facing our own deaths and coming to terms with our own mortality and the mortality of others? And I was just interested to get your views on whether you think that's like a missing part of the modern conversation around humanism and where we're heading, like whether we need to look at death.
Yes, that's hugely important, but you put your finger right on it. I hadn't heard the term, but I totally I totally agree with that, because I believe that our greatest teacher of all is nature. And when you watch nature, on a kind of a yearly cycle, and watch the trees, where I live, are shedding, and they're fertilizing the ground. And then next year, there are new buds coming. And there's this extraordinary kind of cooperation between the leaf system and the root system. It's not just that the roots are providing nutrient that will grow new leaves, but the leaves themselves, through photosynthesis and chlorophyll, are sending energy right down through the trunk into the root system and building up the roots. So it's an epigenetic model in which every subsequent stage builds upon, incorporates, but transcends all the previous stages. And one of those stages is the disintegration of the space suit. And nature models that for us excellently, that everything, in a sense, disintegrates. But it's the disintegration of Shiva energy. It is not the disintegration of the annihilation of all that exists. It's the redistribution of the elements into brand new configurations. And the same thing is true of the human physical body, that we are meant to contribute to the rest of life. We think that we're the apex, we're the kind of the top predators. When you think about even our diet, You know, what feeds on what? And we think that we're the top of the pyramid. That somehow like herbivores, you know, exist by eating plant life. And then carnivores exist by eating herbivores. And then omnivores exist by eating carnivores and omnivores. And then humans exist by eating everything in sight. And we're the top of the pinnacle. And we're not. On my eyelashes right now, there are tens of millions of critters that are being born and living and mating and dying on my eyelashes. I'm not even, literally. You know, I'm exchanging my molecular spacesuit with every single breath I take in and out. I'm exchanging millions of molecules of matter with my environment, with everybody in this room. At the end of this session today, we will have exchanged millions of molecules of matter with each other. At the end of every month, I have lost every single skin cell in my body and replaced it with new skin cells. 50% of the dust in your home is dead skin cells. It's been replaced. On a 6-week cycle, every single cell in your stomach lining is replaced. You know, on a 6-month cycle, every single cell in your skeletal system is replaced. And on a 7-year cycle, every single cell in your entire body is replaced with new cells. But it's been programmed to kind of put in the new cell where the old cell existed. So it looks the same, but it's not. And at some stage, it's going to wear out. And at that stage, then I'm carrying in my gut now. The vast bulk of my 150 pounds is not Seán. It's a microbiome. It is a biology which is not me. They're using me as a taxi cab. I'm an Uber system for it. And it gives a whole new meaning to the kind of the great notion of the Ubermensch, you know, the Superman. I'm literally an Ubermensch. I'm a taxi cab for all of these life forms that are existing through me. They're contributing something to me, but basically I'm a taxi cab to move these around. So I'm not the top of any pyramid whatsoever. And when I die, I'll give whatever is left of me, I'm going to dedicate it to the worms or whatever. So this is not a pyramid. This is a cycle of life. And the cycle is that everything that exists in this cycle contributes to everything else that exists in this cycle. And so this dying process is a sacrament. I claim that we experience 23 different sacraments in the course of subsequent incarnations. And one of the last sacraments is the sacrament of death. And it is a sacrament. It is the next stage of the evolutionary process. But this extraordinary desacralized world in which we live, this demythologized world that's presented to us by the mass media, is scared, absolutely scared of illness, and the ultimate scare is death itself. Where in fact, death is the ultimate embrace of our soul selves and the abandonment of this role we played. It's like an actor at the end of the play that goes back into the green room and takes off the costume and goes back into who they really are, you know, whether it's a wife or a mother or whatever she really does. And that's who she really is. She has to abandon the kind of in the green room, abandon the costume and pick up who she really is. And death is the shuffling off this mortal coil, this spacesuit we needed in order to play a role in a current incarnation. And to fear that is ludicrous. It is to fear discovering who you are and to cling to the illusion of whom you're not. So that's a great observation, Amy.
I'm getting old. I will be 80 this year. And I don't want to be too concerned, although I am. Am I doing enough? Have I done what I should do in this world? Rather than just take a day at a time, a minute at a time, and let life happen. When my husband was dying, I asked him once, I said, "Are you afraid of this journey you're on?" He said, "Not at all. I'm only going home." And he taught us so much that I think about that a lot.
Yes.
But do we even need to be concerned as long as we live the minute that we're in?
The concern is about living the present moment to the best of my ability in the most loving way I can. So concern only about being here now, being nowhere, now and here. And so taking whatever is ahead of, whether it's eating an orange or preparing food or petting the kitty cat, you know, or saying your rosary beads, whatever it is, whatever activity you're engaged in, to do it with full mindfulness. And this is the great insight of Eastern mysticism, you know, the mindfulness with which we engage in every single action, and the realization that we're on a journey. and there's an end point to this journey. I'll share this story with you. When I was a kid growing up, I lived with my great-grandmother for a period of time. And my great-grandmother was a member of the Third Order of St. Francis. There are 3 orders of St. Francis. There was the Franciscan Friars. There was the kind of the St. Clare had created, the Second Order, which is the Poor Clares. And then there was a third order, which was for lay people, married people. And there was a special medal that they wore, signifying they were members of the Third Order of St. Francis. And there was a special gift. They were allowed to be buried in a Franciscan robe when they died. And they were issued this robe, whenever they wanted to. And we had a neighbor, Mrs. O'Shea. And this is gospel truth. Every single night, if you visit Mrs. O'Shea, she had this robe, this burial shroud in which she was going to be buried. And she'd be sitting in front of the fire with the robe dangled over her knees, warming the robe. And you say to her, Mrs. O'Shea, why are you wearing your burial robe over your knees? And she says, I don't want to be buried in a cold shroud, so I'm keeping it warm. So literally that was her attitude. She was going to go. This was her gift from St. Francis, that she'd be buried with this significant symbol. And she wanted to make sure that it was in good working order, when they put her into the box. Yeah.
I have 2 questions on the topic of forgiveness. Is God going to, at the very end, forgive Satan?
Absolutely.
And second is, I come from the South Texas border, and I actually, write fiction about it. And one of the things that is going on now is the cartels are infiltrating all the border towns through kids, 13-year-olds.
Yes.
And there's a huge movement, not only there, but also in Mexico, of this worship of the Santa Muerte,
Yes.
holy death.
Yes.
And it's become crazy. And so you have some Catholics who think that, it's just another saint, so
Yes.
we can also venerate her. On the other hand, the cartels apparently are praying for horrible things and even sacrificing children,
Right.
I have heard.
Yes.
Now, there are Catholic exorcists
Yes.
who claim that they have cast demons out of people who have been possessed by the Santa Muerte.
Yes.
And so is the Santa Muerte an egregore? One of the things that's also true of that area is a deep devotion to the Virgin Mary, the Virgen of Guadalupe. So there seems to be also that egregore fighting with the other egregore, and it's total chaos. And the worst victims are these kids.
Right.
And so my question is this what is actually going on? These egregores fighting each other and everybody getting pulled into this evil, like you were talking about. And what can we do as a community? Because right now everybody seems so separated from God that the communities we grew up in, that were very ritualized, are no longer there.
Good. 2 great questions. For the first question, will God ultimately forgive Satan? I remember, as I told you, as a small child, I lived with my great-grandparents, my great-grandmother, and she would pray the rosary every single night in front of the fireplace. And we'd kneel around with our elbows on chairs, our back to the fireplace, and she was sitting at the fireplace, looking into the fireplace. And we'd pray the rosary. And at the end of the rosary, after we said 5 decades just at that stage, and at the end of the rosary, there were called the trimmings. And these were kind of prayers of petition, where everybody got to pray for something that was important to them. And so one person might say, I want to pray for Tommy Murphy, who's after emigrating to England. Please, God, don't let him marry a Protestant, keep him out of danger. And somebody else would say, the fox just attacked and ate 5 of our chickens. Please protect the rest of our chickens from the fox. And I remember one night, I have no idea where it came from. I'm about 5 years old at the time. And all of a sudden, I hear myself saying, please, God, forgive the devil and let him back into heaven. And there's this shocked silence. And my grandmother says, in the name of God, child, what are you talking about? And my great-grandmother, who was her mother, said, Francis, leave the child alone. God knows exactly what he's saying. Yeah. Now, I don't know whether I was figuring if we could get the devil back into heaven, Mary could keep an eye on him and he wouldn't be able to kind of mess up the rest of us, or whether I really felt like I had such compassion that I couldn't stomach anybody being separated eternally from a source. And so as a simple answer to your first question, yes, I totally believe that everything falls back into the heart of God, and that there's nothing anybody can do, no matter how destructive or devious it is, that cannot be kind of be washed away and healed by pure unconditional love. So yes, everything that exists, in all of the realms, in the entire phenomenological realms, ultimately will find its way back to God, including Satan, I believe. So that's my answer to your first question. About this kind of the Santa Muerte notion, this idea that you can kind of sanctify death. It's amazing to me that part of the technique of any cabal or any evil enterprise is to turn something which is previously sacred into something which is now demonic. And that's exactly what you do. So obviously the respect for death, which is very, very part of the Hispanic culture, this extraordinarily beautiful, for instance, on is it November 1st, Dia de los Muertos, where you pray for the deceased members of the family. That's really, really beautiful. So the deviousness is that you take something which is sacramental and sacred, and you give a version of it that mimics the original, but which is antithetical to the original, where you're worshiping death in the sense that you're worshiping the ability to actually murder other people in a criminal activity, and somehow you dress this up with an iconography and a kind of a sacramental lifestyle, which seduces people into thinking this is just another branch. Or you take the Virgin Mary, the Virgin de Guadalupe, this extraordinary, compassionate Mother of God, this feminine face of the divine, and you somehow make her a kind of a co-conspirator or co-criminal in this enterprise of sacrificing little children or killing 100,000 Americans die every year from fentanyl overdoses that are coming across the Mexican border, basically from China. And so that's what I mean by this this cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to kind of create this utter devastation and separate souls from the source. And one of the main ways of that is turning spirituality into religion, and turning religion into fundamentalism, and turning fundamentalism into the antithesis of spirituality. And I'll actually talk about that more in tomorrow's lecture. So in answer to that question, yes, I believe this is actually of demonic origins, and there is need for exorcisms of this kind of situation, that somehow the devil needs to be confronted on his own battlefield. And there are some very, very brave souls, exorcists, who risk, their own sanity, at least their own sanity, in doing battle with these entities. So yes, you're absolutely right on. So Roger Marsh is a good friend of mine, and Roger has been involved with the integral transformative practice for many, many years. There was a system created by George Leonard and Michael Murphy, and they produced one extraordinary book called The Future of the Body, which talks about the extraordinary abilities of the human body when we understand what it is ultimately capable of. And he created integral transformative practice, and both Michael Choi and Roger and some other people here have been practitioners of that. And it is a practice of mind, body, soul, and in particular actually exercises which can allow you to experience some of these abilities. Now, what Roger was commenting on was that we're being artificially seduced, but we have iPads that can make us kind of omniscient immediately. You can go onto Wikipedia and find an answer to any question you have. You can memorize, whole bunches of information. You can kind of learn foreign languages while you're asleep. And so we're being seduced in many ways. And Roger was asking himself and the rest of us, how do we avoid this level of seduction? And how do you instead attract people into real spirituality and the attendant siddhis that go along with that? So I'm going to respond then to Roger's contribution right here now. Part of it has to do with the timeline itself, because one of the things that I've seen, for instance, in my interest in mythology, is that 2 or 3 generations of Irish people lost their stories and their mythology and even their language. And then at some stage, they woke up to the fact, my God, we've impoverished ourselves. Our culture has been destroyed. When I was a child growing up in Europe, people were really, really, really poor. Literally, it was to have food on the table was a major achievement when I was a little child. Certainly, there was no, I didn't have cars, you know, we didn't have telephones, you know, we would never go traveling to Europe unless we were emigrating. And so in the 1960s, things began to change and Ireland became very, very wealthy. And over the next 2 or 3 generations, we lost our culture, we lost our spirituality. Now, that was compounded by the fact that we realized the extraordinary sexual corruption in parts of the Catholic clergy and the cover-up that the bishops were engaged in. So there was a loss of faith in religion, at least, and there was the kind of the seduction of finances and economic abilities. And so we're going through a period where people have abandoned real spirituality and abandoned culture. But they're beginning to see the long-term consequences of this. And now the language has been revived and the culture has been revived. And it's one of the things I attempted to do in Kenya was to try to encourage people to not lose their mythology and not lose their languages and to kind of revisit their own kind of native spiritualities. So what's going to save us at this stage? The realization at some stage that once we finally realize that we've been propagandized and censored, that there's only one version of the story, and that 100,000 American, mainly children, are dying of overdoses of fentanyl right now, and that there's a mass suicide. Studies have shown that with teenagers, that when you're talking about, for instance, allegedly advanced civilizations, kind of the Western world, that the suicide rate has gone off the charts, and that for every young girl that commits suicide, there are 6 young boys who are committing suicide. So we've emasculated our males, because there are no initiation rites anymore. People are ashamed to be male anymore. The worst configuration on planet Earth now is to be male, to be white, and to be heterosexual. And so you're looking at this extraordinary fallout from the system. Now, at some stage, people are going to wake up to the realization that you can only censor the information for so long. And people are going to wake up to the fact, here's the kind of the end result of what we're been following at this stage. And at that stage, I think people are going to start waking up, and hopefully there'll be enough of the elders still left to try to educate us on what the culture looked like and what mystical spirituality looked like and what an ordinary lifestyle looked like, where we interacted face to face with each other and hugged each other. So I think to respond kind of directly to your kind of observation, Roger, it's going to take time for enough people to wake up sufficiently to realize you can't put a Band-Aid on this situation anymore. We did that in the past. You could put Band-Aids in situations and temporarily believe that you'd fixed. You know, it needs major, major, major surgery of every literally form of life. I created a document several months ago that I called The Mission of the Light Bringers, in which I looked at, the light bringers needs to dismantle the educational models, the entertainment models, the financial models, the political models, the religious models, the agricultural models, and replace it with a totally different way of being a human community. So I think it'll come. I think this is the era of global awakening, but there's a global reset, which is kind of in charge of the operation right now. So personally, I believe we'll get there, but it means that more and more groups have to come fully awake, and interact with each other and create this network of systems. Yeah. Brilliant. So Andrea made a comment that picking up on the story I told about as a young child, praying that Satan be allowed back into heaven. And Andrea has been involved for 30 years in the Companions on the Journey movement. So we know each other well, and we know the kind of the belief systems that we have. She's also a member of a Divine Mother grouping where they try to do the very same thing. It's a ritual in which on encountering any of these evils we've spoken about right now, whether they're cartels or, kind of demonic possessions or whatever, that one of the kind of the rituals of which she's a part is to say, go to the light, go to the light, go to the light. And so it's a form of forgiveness, and it's a form of bathing even the dark forces with light. Because it's interesting to me that a single candle in a dark room, will bring light into the room. No amount of darkness will quench a single candle. No matter how much darkness is surrounding one candle, it won't out the candle. But one lit candle will kind of make a huge difference in the amount of darkness in a particular space. And so this response of focusing on the feminine face of God, or the kind of maternal aspect of God, this becomes really, really important. And I think, you know, that it is the kind of the mother love, you know, that no matter how deformed or kind of, you know, handicapped a baby is, you know, almost no mother will abandon her child. You know, she'll see goodness in the child, that's kind of the essence of the feminine face of God, and that no matter how askew the world has become, that the feminine face of God, or Mother Mary, or, you know, Tara, you know, or, you know, whatever word you want to give to it, in, you know, the Shekhinah in the Hebrew tradition, that this feminine face of God is there to kind of pick it up, you know, and love it into the light, rather than warn it into the light. You can't warn into the light. You know, you can kind of radiate it into the light by sending all that kind of mother love to it. So great point, Andre. Thank you. Yeah. So this is Anne asking about her belief in reincarnation, and wondering, you know, when we come into reincarnation, aren't we already God before we come? And so when I come back, am I trying to kind of help the rest of the world, you know, to kind of find the light? And you're absolutely right. And there's a term for that in Buddhism, Anne. It's called the Bodhisattva vow. It is individual souls, individual fractals of source, who have worked off all their own, they've learned what they've come to learn in this particular dimension. They don't need to come back anymore, because there's nothing else they can learn from being on planet Earth. But they take a vow in order to kind of wake up the rest of us. And so the Bodhisattva vow is to keep reincarnating on planet Earth until all sentient beings wake up to who they really are. And I use an example of many, many times of that a Special Olympics, which was held in Montreal back in the 70s, of kind of handicapped people. And there was this particular 100-yard dash, and a dash is a kind of a euphemism for what actually happened. And there were Down syndrome adults, you know, and they line up at the starting line, and the gun goes off, and they start kind of trundling up the path. And halfway up, one little fella falls, and he cuts his knee, and he's sitting on the track, and his knee is bleeding, and he's crying. And the rest of the group hear him crying, and they stop running, and they turn back, and they see their comrade sitting on the track crying. And they all walk back, and they lift him up, and they link arms, and they walk up the rest of the track together, and they all go across the finishing line as a unit. And the entire stadium, you know, stood up and gave them literally a standing ovation. Now, that's what the Bodhisattva vow is about, in the sense that nobody gets to heaven until everybody gets to heaven. In the sense that, how could you be up in heaven, you know, kind of throwing Coke bottles at the people down in hell and saying, nah, I made it and you didn't. You know, there is no way that heaven consists of people who say, I'm glad I made it, you know, up to you guys now to kind of figure it out on your own. You can't be in the ultimate form of heaven as long as there are any sentient suffering beings. And so people with that mindset or that soul set are going to keep revisiting, you know, to just contribute to this race of Down syndrome kids, which is what we all are when we identify with our space and we cross the line together. Right. So Karen's question had to do with stuff that we talked about this morning, and that is the notion of, you know, the brain, which I really believe as a reducing mechanism, that it is at very best, it's a receiver and a transmitter of consciousness. There's no way in which it's the origin of consciousness. And what it appears to be is actually a reducing valve. And there's actually an area in the brain, the parietal lobe, and at the back of the brain, which acts as a filtering system for the sensory data coming in, because we would be totally overwhelmed if you could allow your brain to try to process everything you see in this room right now. Just literally take 2 seconds and look around you. And I guarantee you, you could spend the rest of your life trying to explain and articulate everything your sensorium has processed, has taken in right now. You couldn't do it. You'd be totally flooded. So there are these mechanisms in the physical brain that filter out the vast bulk of these data in order for you to have enough that you can actually work with. So it's like taking a drink of water from a fire hydrant. You will drown. You'll literally drown yourself because it'll go straight into your lungs and you'll die. And so we use a little tap, and we can turn the tap up or down, depending on how much water we want to take in. And so the brain is a filtering mechanism. Now, what happens is sometimes when there's traumatic brain injury, or in autistic children, for instance, that this reducing mechanism isn't working properly. And so there's an influx of data, you know, that is flooding the system. which is creating this extraordinary abilities, because you get these are geniuses at mathematics or in art, or in kind of music. Now, so should we open up the valve completely and just flood the system? If we did, the ego would be extinguished completely, and you would not be able to inhabit a spacesuit. You could not have a human experience if the reducing valve were opened fully. Yeah, you'd be so flooded with data that you'd be totally incapable in these spacesuits of processing and being able to tie your shoelaces or stop at a red light. And so it's very important that there be the reducing valve there while we're in the space suits. Now, when we shuffle off this mortal coil, as we begin to move up through the systems, there's less reducing happening at the etheric level. There's still less happening at the astral level. There's far less happening at the mental level. There's very little happening at the psychic level. And there's almost nothing happening at the soul level. And there's absolutely nothing happening by way of reduction at the source level. But we couldn't handle it. There would be so much data, it would extinguish the ego. And that's why you find, for instance, autistic kids who got these extraordinary abilities in mathematics or music or whatever. They're useless at social relationships. They can't make eye contact. And the reason is that, there's so much info flooding in that they can't establish kind of meaningful sociological relationships. So they're very, very bad at relationships, mainly, because they've been flooded with data more than they can accommodate. So their focus in is like a kind of a defense mechanism that could focus in on a particular band of data, and they become excellent at that, become real geniuses at that, but they kind of filter out everything else. So it's a selective filtering system for them. Karen's question was, if autism or brain injury, creates a problem for the reducing mechanism, so that they're flooded with data in specific areas and become really, really, really good at that. They may not be really good at personal relationships, but they seem to have this extraordinary compassion. So how come that they can have this compassion at the same time their relationships and their sociological abilities are compromised in some way? There was a friend of mine, a priest from the same order as myself, called Eddie Lawler. And Eddie took a sabbatical many, many years ago, and he spent it in a home in France, which was founded by Jean-Pierre. It's a living situation where there are equal parts mentally handicapped people and, ordinary people. So lots of Down syndrome's kids living with ordinary human beings, typically 6, a household of 12, and so he lived there for a year with that group. And at one stage, he took a trip across the English Channel from France to England on these, hovercrafts, yeah? And these 6 kids are with him, and there's a bunch of French businessmen on the trip as well, going to England for the day. The hovercraft only takes maybe half an hour and a half to go across the English Channel. And then Eddie is sitting with these business people, and they're all talking about the state of the world, how bad the finances is, and and kind of the business models are going to hell, and are they ever going to survive? And they're sitting around the table complaining like hell. And the kids are running around the boat, enjoying the boat. And all of a sudden they run into this room and they start hugging and kissing everybody. And then they run out. And then one of the guys turns to him and he says, "Sad, isn't it?" And then he said, "Sad? Is that what you call sad? How about this conversation that's been going on here for the last hour and a half?" And so there is obviously that these kids have this extraordinary penchant for kind of being compassionate. And so to answer directly, my sense is that they haven't picked up on the rules of society because they're not really tuned in to societal norms. So they didn't learn to look out for myself, or they didn't learn to kind of degrade the handicapped people or the people who are poor or homeless or whatever. They didn't learn those lessons. They never learned those rules. So they're operating outside that system. And so now they see somebody who's suffering and they do exactly what the soul tells them to do. Give him a hug, kiss him, or whatever. So they didn't learn the rule set that the rest of us believed was actually how to behave. So Stefan's comment and question is about, the level of corruption, which is kind of endemic to society and going back long, long ways. And he had used particularly a story about a Catholic charity. It was Boys Town, you said the name of it, where there was this extraordinary level of corruption in which, you know, the town, the kind of the administrators of it, and at the city level and the county level and politically, that everybody was involved, possibly even a pedophile ring. And this has been true from the word go. You know, every system is corruptible, and most systems are corrupted. And so it's a question of this stage, would I say that, you know, you have to totally dismantle the old system. You have to go from being, you know, and I'll talk about this again tomorrow in more detail, but the realization that we have to create new pipes which are populated by transformed human beings. New wine skins. We can't continue to put band-aids on existing situations, because we have a proverb in Irish that says, which literally means working hand in hand like the devil and his grandfather. And so that literally very, very often the newspaper people, the pharmaceutical industry, the politicians, the church people, the agricultural, big agriculture, big pharma, etc., they're all in bed together. And when you control the kind of the narrative and you censor alternative aspects, it's very hard to organize a resistance. But there are always alternative medias. There are always ways of alerting other people. And so trying to find out what are alternative perspectives. I do a lot of couples counseling, and the first session I ever do with any couple is, what I've seen is that there are 4 basic issues that cause problems in relationships. And the first one is communication. The second one is finances. The third one is sexuality. And the fourth one is belief systems, you know, philosophy of life. But it all boils down firstly to communication. So the first few sessions, I've created 10 rules for good communication, you know, and I ask them to work with those, and I give them a test where they test their own ability as communicators, and they assign a value to their partner. And then I use that as a template to look at what are their strengths and what are their weaknesses. And one of the most important things is learning to, so the first 4 rules are, I got actually from Native American Indian tradition. The first one is show up, pay attention, speak your truth without judging, attacking, or blaming, and do not be attached to an outcome. They're the first 4 rules of the 10. Now, when I talk about the second one, pay attention, you know, what I say is this: when a couple comes into my office, so I had a kind of a couch and I had a single chair, and I'd watch where did they sit. If they sat on the couch, that was a good start. If one guy sat on the couch and the other guy sat in the single chair, I know immediately this is, you know, serious stuff going on here. And I'd watch what they do with their body language. And so if they're sitting side by side, you know, and Fred is turned in that direction, and I'm his partner, I am turned in this direction, we're not facing each other. I'm seeing immediately, there's problems here. They won't even face each other. And then the next thing I look at is, what are they doing with their hands? If they're sitting like this, I know there's self-protection going on here. You know, I'm protecting my viewpoint right here, and you're protecting yours. And then the fourth thing I look at is their eyes. Buddhism talks about soft gaze and harsh gaze. So if I'm going like this, I mean, I'm angry with you. And so it's obvious to you, this is going to be a difficult session. If I'm embracing you with my eyes, it means I'm open to what you have to tell me. I listen. And so part of it is, you know, really listening at many, many levels. If I interrupt you as soon as you say something I disagree with, I'm not listening to you. If I allow you to finish what you said, but then only respond to the part I disagreed with, I haven't been listening to you. I've been waiting for you to say something I disagreed with, and I'm biding my time, twirling my thumbs, waiting for your mouth to stop moving, and then I'm going to attack you at the place we disagreed. Real listening is, I hear everything you said, you know, I check out with you, is this what you said? And tell me, what did you mean? But I don't quite understand. What did you mean when you said X? And until I understand everything you said, I'm not entitled to respond to you. So what I do with the couples, I say, okay, listen to what your partner just said. Now repeat back what you think you heard your partner say. Now check with your partner. Is that what you actually said? No, I didn't say that. Oh, sorry. Can you say it again? Okay, here's what I actually said. Okay, you heard what was said. You know, can you repeat back? What did you hear this time? You know, and you said, was that what you said? Well, almost. You didn't quite hear everything, so let me say it again. So we get a third iteration, and now checking with you. Can you repeat back what you heard? Okay, here's what I think I heard. And now I check it out. Is that what you said? Yes, that's what I said. Okay. Now I can respond to you. But I need to respond to everything you said, not just the part that I disagreed with. In other words, it's obvious to me that I was really listening to you, and I could appreciate what the issue might be for you. And now I'm going to tell you what it feels like from my side, and you're going to check in and find out, did you hear what the other person said. So part of it is that we have to be able to share alternative perspectives, and check out that that's exactly what the other person meant and said. But at the moment, when there's censorship and propaganda, there's only a single perspective, and there's no ability to give feedback or to question what the other person meant by what they did or said. So that's the conundrum in which we find ourselves. When you manage the mass media and there's only one story, then there's very little chance of getting an alternative perspective out there. And that's the need for alternative media of various kinds. And that's the reason why I say that it's going to be small communities who are kind of conversant with each other, live together, that these are the people who talk through these kinds of issues. And then there'll be kind of a neuronal network, a lattice of small communities exchanging information. Here's how we do agriculture. Here's how we grow our food. Here's how we are educating our children. Here's how we are healing our illnesses. Here's how we are managing the finances of our little community. And we begin to share these great insights that people have. And slowly by slowly, we radically transform how human beings are doing life on planet Earth, and is taken away from the tyrannical models, those who take in charge of the meme making, and everybody becomes a storyteller. I said at the beginning yesterday that there are two kinds of storytelling. There's where you have a Shenachri, the official storyteller who's in charge of the story and telling the story. And then there's the other version where I give the first line and Karen gives the next line, and Anna gives the next line after that, and then Janice, and we go right around the whole group and we create the story together. We have to create the story together.